Okay, so when you see those headlines about like the stock market going up and down like crazy,
Yeah.
especially when they're talking about all this stuff about tariffs and trade wars,
Uh-huh.
you ever feel like you're missing something, like you're not quite getting the whole picture?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like everyone's in on this secret,
Yeah.
and you're just trying to like piece it together from like snippets of conversation.
Right. Like, what does it all mean? And why should I even care?
Exactly.
Well, good news. Today, we're going to dive deep into all of that. We're going
Yeah.
to talk about these recent market swings that happened after some pretty big announcements on tariffs,
Right.
specifically focusing on the U.S. and its trading partners.
Okay.
We've got this CBS News report that lays everything out, gets some expert opinions, and we're going to break it all down for you so
Yeah.
you can understand what's really going on
Exactly.
and what it might mean for, well, all of us.
Without getting lost in all the Wall Street jargon.
All right, so let's jump right in. This CBS report highlights a pretty wild day in the market. Last Wednesday.
Oh, yeah.
What happened that got everybody so excited?
So Wednesday, President Trump announced that he was hitting pause on some of those tariff hikes.
Okay.
And this applied to most U.S. trading partners, actually,
Wow.
which was a little bit of a surprise for a lot of people.
Right.
But there was a big exception.
I bet I know who it is.
Didn't I?
Of course.
That's right.
And so the market reacted pretty strongly to this news.
Oh, yeah.
Things went up, right?
They really did. I mean,
Right.
the S&P 500, which is kind of a good overall measure of the stock market,
Uh-huh.
that jumped up 9.5%,
Wow.
which is huge.
That's a lot.
And that was actually its third best day since the 1940s.
Wow.
So a really big jump.
Big jump.
The Dow Jones, that gained almost 3,000 points,
Yeah.
which is about a 7.9% increase.
Huge.
And then the NASDAQ, which is, really heavy on those tech stocks,
Yeah.
that went up 12.2%.
So everyone was just super happy.
It seems that way.
Well, the report actually quotes Stephen Innes from SPI Asset Management.
Yeah.
He said that investors went from fear to euphoria.
That's a big swing.
That is a big swing. What was driving that shift? Why were people so suddenly happy?
Well, Innes made a good point.
Yeah.
He said this pause on the tariffs kind of eased fears that we were headed towards a global recession.
Oh, okay.
Some investors were probably thinking, uh-oh, recession's coming, got to position myself for that.
Yeah.
And then this news comes out, and they're like, well, maybe not. Maybe I don't have to do that.
Right.
So they started unwinding those positions.
That makes sense.
And then you've also got exporters in Asia. They were probably worried about those tariffs hitting them.
Yeah.
So they got some relief, too.
So everybody's happy, problem solved, right?
Well, not so fast.
Okay.
Because as we know, the market rarely moves in a straight line.
Oh.
And the very next day, Thursday morning,
Yeah.
things started to turn around.
Okay.
That optimism, it didn't really last. The market gave back a big chunk of those gains from the day before.
Really?
Yeah, the S&P 500 was down 2.3%.
Okay.
Dow Jones down 2.1%.
Wow.
And the NASDAQ down 3%.
So what happened? Did people just decide to cash out after that big jump?
Well, that's probably part of it. When you see a surge like that, some investors are going to take their profits, especially when there's still a lot of uncertainty in the air.
Right.
It's like, okay, I made some money. Let's not get greedy.
Yeah.
But it also shows that, that pause on the tariffs, it was good news, but it didn't fix everything.
Okay.
Those underlying issues, those worries about trade and the economy,
They're still there.
they're still there.
There's a quote in the report from Francis Lunn at Geosecurities.
Yeah.
And he sums it up pretty well. He says, everything is still very volatile because with Donald Trump, you don't know what to expect.
Right.
And he even says the threat of recession hasn't gone away.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point.
Yeah.
One announcement can get people excited, but the bigger picture is still there.
Yeah.
And with all that unpredictability, it's hard to feel completely confident.
Right. So let's go back to something you mentioned before about China being excluded from this tariff pause.
Yeah.
Why is that such a big deal?
Well, the report makes it clear that the tariffs on China weren't just kept in place, they were actually increased.
Okay.
The new tariff level on Chinese imports is now 125%.
125%. That sounds like a lot.
It is.
So while everyone else is getting a break, China's getting hit even harder.
Yeah, and that's why this is such a big deal.
Okay.
Mark Hayfield from UBS, he said that this back and forth between the U.S. and China,
Yeah.
it could really hurt trade between those two countries.
Which are like the two biggest economies in the world.
Exactly. And he's got some numbers to back that up.
Okay.
UBS estimates that the overall effective U.S. tariff rate is now around 27%.
Wow.
And that's up from 9% before April 2nd.
That's a big jump.
It is. But here's the thing. If you take China out of the equation, that effective rate drops down to 11%.
Oh, so it's really targeted at China.
It seems that way.
So even with this pause for everyone else, the trade war with China is still raging on.
Absolutely.
The report even uses the phrase tit for tat to describe what's going on. Can you explain what that means for those of us who aren't trade experts?
Sure. Tit for tat basically means one country does something like, puts a tariff on another country's goods.
Okay.
And then that other country retaliates and does the same thing back.
Like a trade war.
Exactly.
Oh.
And that's what we're seeing between the U.S. and China.
Right.
Each side keeps slapping tariffs on more and more stuff.
Okay.
And it can escalate pretty quickly.
And the report also points out that even after that big market jump on Wednesday, U.S. stocks were still lower than they were the week before when all those initial tariffs were announced.
That's right. So that one day of excitement didn't erase all the losses.
Okay. Now let's talk about inflation. That's been a big topic lately.
Yeah.
What's the latest on that, and how do these tariffs play into it?
Well, the Consumer Price Index, CPI, which basically measures how much we're all paying for things, that actually showed some good news.
Okay.
Inflation went up 2.4% in March.
Okay.
Which is a little slower than it's been.
So things are calming down a bit.
It seems like it.
Right.
And that's good news for the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
The central bank here in the U.S.,
right.
They've been really focused on inflation as they try to figure out what to do with interest rates.
Okay, so how do these tariffs make their job harder?
Well, Chris Zaccarelli from Northlight Asset Management explained it well in the report.
Yeah.
If the tariffs start hurting the economy, the Fed might want to lower interest rates to help things out.
Okay.
But they also don't want to do that if inflation is still a problem.
Right, so they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah. But this slightly cooler CPI data, that might give them some breathing room.
That's
like Adam Crisafulli from Vital Knowledge said, there was a fairly big cooling in inflation in March.
Oh.
So maybe the Fed can be a little more flexible in how they respond if things get rocky because of the tariffs.
But there's a catch, right?
There's always a catch.
Crisafulli also says that these past inflation numbers might not tell the whole story.
Yeah, he thinks the real impact of those tariffs from the Trump administration, we haven't even seen it yet.
Oh.
It takes time for those tariffs to filter through the economy and affect prices.
Right.
So the inflation data from March, it might not show the full picture of what's to come.
That makes sense. So it's like we're looking in the rearview mirror instead of straight ahead.
Kind of.
The report also mentions the Producer Price Index, or PPI. What is that, and why should we care about it?
The PPI looks at the prices that businesses are paying for their supplies and materials.
Okay.
And it's kind of a heads up for consumer inflation.
How so?
Well, if businesses are paying more for their stuff, maybe because of tariffs on imports, they're going to pass those costs along to us eventually.
Right. Makes sense.
So we end up paying more too. Watching the PPI can give us a clue about whether higher inflation is coming down the road.
Okay. So putting it all together, what are the experts saying about where things are headed?
It seems like the main takeaway is uncertainty.
Uncertainty, yeah.
Like Chris Zaccarelli said, it's too early to celebrate because the damage from tariffs has just been postponed for now.
Right, so we had that burst of excitement, but then reality set in.
Yeah, the trade tensions, especially with China, they haven't gone away.
And we don't know what the full impact on inflation will be yet.
Exactly. So we got to stay tuned.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully this deep dive has given you a better understanding of all the different forces at play here.
Yeah.
It's complicated stuff, but it affects all of us.
It really does. The global economy, it's all interconnected.
And decisions in one place can ripple out and affect things like, well, how much we pay for our groceries.
You got it. And it's a good reminder that even good news can change things up pretty quickly.
Yeah. So with all this back and forth, all these different viewpoints, what are you going to be watching most closely in the coming weeks to try and figure out where things are going?
Well, I'm going to be keeping an eye on those inflation numbers, for sure.
Yeah.
The CPI, the PPI, all of that.
Okay.
And I'm going to be watching how things develop between the U.S. and China.
Yeah.
Because that's a big wild card.
Absolutely. It's a story that's still being written.
That's for sure.
And staying informed means knowing what to look for.
You got it.
Thanks for breaking it all down for us.
No problem. Anytime.
We'll be back next time with another deep dive into the news that matters.
Sounds good.
See you then.